Hi, I'm Myra, and today I'm going to be showing you a tutorial on how to knit a pair of socks from start to finish. This tutorial includes a free pattern which is available for download on my website and on my Ravelry page, which you can find the links to the pattern below in the description below this video. We are going to be knitting in magic loop, and we're going to knit a vanilla sock with an afterthought heel. So I will let you go ahead and collect your supplies and print out your pattern, and then I'll see you back here and we'll talk about casting on the cuff. Okay, so now we are going to cast on for our socks. And since this pattern is written from the cuff down, we are going to start with the full number of stitches we will be knitting for our socks. So this pattern is written in 2 sizes. I am going to be knitting the larger of the 2 sizes because the person I am knitting for has wider feet. So I am going to do the long tail cast on, which is my go-to cast on when I'm knitting. Pretty much this is how I always cast on unless the pattern I'm knitting calls for something different. So what you're going to do is you're going to create a slip knot, and you're going to leave this long tail. And so your tail should be about 3 times the width of your project. So you will, over time, get a feel for how long that is. So I've got my slip knot, I've got my long tail. I am left with 2 strands of yarn. This strand over here is leading to my yarn ball, and then this strand is leading to, this is just the tail. So what I'm going to do, so I'm going to move that out of the way, I'm going to hold my needle in my right hand, I'm going to take my left hand and I'm going to put the tail over my thumb and the piece of yarn going to the yarn ball over my index finger. Then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go under this piece of yarn and around and then through this loop. And I'm just going to pull it tight. You don't want it to be super, super tight. You are not creating a knot to keep someone in their socks. That's not what you're doing here. So you just want to pick up that piece of yarn, go under this guy and through this loop. And so you're going to do that, if you're knitting the smaller sock, you're going to do that 60 times, and if you're knitting the larger sock, you're going to do it 64. So I'm going to go ahead and cast on my 64 stitches. Okay, so now that you've got all of your stitches cast on, you're going to go and you're going to push your stitches so that they are in the middle of your needle, so they're on this flexible cable here. And what you're going to do is you're going to find the center of your sock. So if you cast on 32 stitches, you want 32 stitches on each side. So I'm going to go and count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32. So now I found that center, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fold my cable, and then I'm going to pull this loop through. So now what you will see is that we have half of our stitches on one side and half of our stitches on the other side. So the right side, when you're holding it, if you're, excuse me, I'm sorry. So the front, these stitches right here, this is going to be needle 1 and this is going to be needle 2. So now what you're going to do is you're going to pull this cord through, so you have these stitches, sorry about that noise, you have these stitches on your needle, and you're going to take this needle and you're just going to pull it through so that you have a little bit of room to work with. So you are going to take your working yarn, which is going to your yarn ball, and you want to make sure that you are grabbing the working yarn and not this tail that we're going to weave in later. So you're going to take Sorry, I just gotta reposition my yarn. So you're gonna take your working yarn and you're gonna join in the round. So you're just gonna start your cuff, which we are going to do a 2x2 knit purl rib. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna take our working yarn and we're gonna knit the first stitch, and we're gonna knit the second stitch, cast on a bit tightly here, and then you're gonna purl 2 stitches, and then you're gonna knit 2 stitches, and you're just gonna keep going all the way around this round, and then you are going to keep working this 2x2 rib until you have a cuff that is about 1 1/4 inches long. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to knit my cuff, and then I will come back and we will talk about the leg. Okay, so now that I've knit my cuff so that it is 1 1/4 inches from the cast on edge, I'm ready to start knitting the leg of my sock. For this pattern, we are going to knit the leg in stockinette stitch, which is just the basic knit stitch. And so to do that, I'm going to push my needle back into my knitting. I'm going to take this other needle, pull it out so I have a little bit of room to work with, insert it into this first stitch, and knit again, and then now I'm at these 2 purl stitches, but since we're going to knit the cuff and, since we're knitting the leg in stockinette, I'm going to knit these 2, and I'm just going to knit all the way around. Okay, now that I've finished that first row of all knit stitches, I'm just going to keep going around, knitting every stitch until my leg measures 8 inches from the cast on edge. So 8 inches, including this 1 1/4 inch of the cuff that we just knit. Okay, so I've now completed my leg. It is 8 inches long from the cast on edge to right here, and I'm ready to put in my waste yarn for my heel. So here I have my waste yarn. It's this green piece of fingering weight yarn. This is a merino, so it's very smooth, which is what you want. You want your waste yarn to be very smooth because it'll make picking up the heel stitches later easier. You also want to pick a color that is very contrasting. So I've picked this green yarn as my waste yarn, and my actual yarn that I'm knitting with has a bunch of reds and pinks and purples. So this green definitely will not blend in and it will not get lost. So for this step, I'm going to knit across the first half of my stitches, just like I normally would. I like to use a double pointed needle for this step, and you'll see why in just a second. So I'm going to insert my needle like I normally would. I'm going to take my waste yarn and I'm going to just wrap it around and knit with my waste yarn. So you want to leave a little bit of a tail, not too much though, just a little bit, and knit across like you normally would. Okay, so our heel, when we're all done, is going to be worked across these 32 stitches if you're knitting the larger size, because the heel is only worked across half the stitches. So now you're going to see why I like to do this with a double pointed needle. Because now that I'm done knitting these heel stitches onto waste yarn, I'm going to go back to the beginning of this round, and I'm going to pick up my working yarn, and I like to hold this waste yarn in my left hand out of the way. I'm just going to pick up my working yarn and knit across these heel stitches that I just knit in waste yarn. So if you had not had a double pointed needle, which is fine, you can definitely do an Afterthough heel and magic loop without an additional needle. But what you would have had to do is you would have had to slide all of your stitches back onto the left needle. So I'll show you when I finish this row. So I can show you now. As you can see, as I'm knitting, all of these stitches are moving onto my working needle, which is held in my right hand. And so if I had knit this row without the double pointed needle, at the end of the row, all of my stitches would have been on this left hand needle. And so in order to knit this row over the waste yarn, I would have had to slip all of the stitches back onto my right hand needle, onto my working needle. And you can definitely do that. That's absolutely doable. But it's just easier to not slip the stitches. And so this is how I do it. But if you don't have a DPN, do not worry about it. Slipping the stitches is not hard. It's just a bit time consuming. And even that is not overly time consuming. Okay, so now as you can see, I've knitted over that waste yarn. I've got the two tails just sort of hanging out here. I like to tuck them inside of the sock just to keep them out of the way. And now I am just going to keep on knitting around and around and around until my sock, the foot of my sock, measures 4 inches less than the total length of my foot. So how I'm going to measure that is I'm going to take this green line, and that's why it needs to be a very contrasting color, is I'm going to take this green line and I'm going to line my ruler up with that line, and that's how I'll measure my sock. So when it's 4 inches shorter than my total desired foot length, I will start decreasing for the heel. So go ahead and continue knitting your sock just as you around and around as you have been, and we will talk about the toes. Okay, so I have knit the entire foot of my sock. Well, not the entire foot. I've knit from this scrap yarn that I placed for my heel to where I'm going to start my toe, and that foot length is 4 inches shorter than the total length of the foot of my sock. So the reason why we do that is because both the heel and the toe are going to take up space. So the toe is going to be about 2 inches long and the heel is going to be about 2 inches long. So when you add those two pieces together, you get the total desired length of your sock. If you were to knit just the plain foot to the total length of, the foot you were knitting for, you would end up with a sock that was way too long because the toe and the heel are going to add to the total length of the sock. So now that I have finished knitting my foot, I am ready to start knitting the heel. I'm ready to start knitting the toe, and the toe is knit in 2 sections. So the first section of the toe is the staggered decrease section. And so for that section, basically what staggered decrease means, or what I've used it to mean in my pattern, is that the decrease rows are staggered. So the first time you do a decrease row, you're going to knit the decrease row, and then you're going to knit 3 plain rounds of just regular knitting. And then you're going to knit another decrease row. And so as you move through it's 16 total rounds. As you move through the toe decreases, the decreases are going to get closer and closer together until once you've finished the staggered decrease section, you're going to decrease every single round. So how these decrease rounds are going to work is I'm starting at the beginning of my round, and I'm going to knit this first stitch. And then for this next stitch, I'm going to slip it as if to purl. I'm going to knit the following stitch, and then I'm going to pass the slip stitch over the knitted stitch. So I'm going to slip my needle tip, I'm going to slip my left needle tip in there, and I'm just going to pull it over that worked stitch. And then I'm going to knit until I have 3 stitches left on my left hand needle. Okay, and now I have these 3 stitches left. So I'm going to knit the first 2 together. So I'm going to just slip my needle tip in through both those loops. I'm going to knit them, and then I'm just going to knit this last stitch. And now I'm going to turn my work over. So I'm working on the top of my foot stitches, the instep stitches. Going to arrange my needles again. And I'm going to knit this first stitch, and then I'm going to slip this stitch as if to purl, knit this stitch, and then I'm going to again pass this stitch, slipped stitch over the worked stitch. I'm going to knit, knit across this row. Okay, so I'm left with 3 stitches from the end, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the other side. So I'm going to knit these first 2 stitches together, and then I'm going to knit 1. And so now my first decrease round is done, and I've decreased a total of 4 stitches, 2 on the front and 2 on the back. And now I'm going to knit 3 plain rounds. So I'm just going to take my knitting, and I'm going to knit around just like I have been doing this entire time. And this can be a little bit tricky to keep track of. Have I knit 2 rounds plain? Have I knit 3 rounds? Like, where am I? And so what I do is I just keep tallies on a piece of paper, and that way I don't lose count of how many rows I've knit. And yes, so you're going to work your way through the staggered decrease section, just following the pattern. Every time it says to do a decrease round, you're going to do the round we just did, and every time it says to work plain, you're just going to knit every single stitch. And then, once you get to the end of the staggered decrease section, so you've worked those 16 rounds, you are going to go and you are going to decrease every single round. So you're going to work that same decrease round, every single round until you have 8 stitches on this needle and 8 stitches on that needle. And then we will come back and we will talk about the Kitchener stitch and how to graft the toe. Okay, so now I have finished my toe decreases and I am ready to graft the toe using the Kitchener stitch. So what I'm going to do first is my sock is still attached to my ball of yarn. I am going to cut my length of yarn. I'm going to leave about an 8 to 10 inch tail. That should be sufficient. You don't need a whole lot, but you definitely want enough that you can graft the toe and then weave in the end once you're finished. So I can take my socks, and as you can see, I have 8 stitches on this side and 8 stitches on that side. So I'm going to sort of push my stitches along to the edge of my needles, and you want this piece of yarn, this yarn tail, coming from the back. So you want it coming from these stitches, the back needle. So you're just going to take your yarn needle. A lot of people call these tapestry needles. Mine is a plastic one because when I was living out in Missouri, this is all that the local Walmart carried. I've seen metal ones with like bent tips, which make hooking stitches really easy. If you don't already have a yarn needle, that's the type I would recommend. So I'm just going to thread it through here. I always sort of lick the ends of my yarn. Maybe that's gross. Don't have to do that, but it definitely does make threading it easier. Okay, so now that that's threaded, I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go into this first stitch on the front needle as if to knit. So I'm just going to take it, pull my needle through, and pull it tight. You don't have to pull it super tight just yet. And then I'm going to slip that stitch off the needle. I usually use my thumb. It's not, the right way, but it works. And then you're going to, this second stitch on this first needle, you're going to insert your yarn needle as if to purl. So now that you've done that, what happened there? How did that do that? 1 second. There we go. Okay. And you want to make sure your yarn tail stays like in the front, like that. All right. So now that you've threaded it through this stitch that was this second stitch, you're going to go to the back needle and you're going to slip your needle into this first stitch as if to purl. And you always want to make sure that your tail, the piece of yarn you're working with, is underneath the needles. You never want to like come over the needle like that. And then you can slip that first stitch off your needles. And so on the back needle, you're going to take your needle and into the second stitch, you're going to insert your needle as if to knit. And you're going to leave that stitch on the needle. So now you're going to come back around to the front and you're going to insert your needle as if to knit. And if you remember, this stitch, we already slipped our needle in as if to purl because it was the second stitch on the needle. So now what you're going to do, now that that's off the needle, you're going to insert your needle as if to purl this second stitch. Ooh. You're going to make sure your yarn doesn't go over the needle like that. And that's when you really want to like sort of tighten this up. And so now we're going to go back to the back needle and you're going to insert your needle as if to purl this first stitch. And then you're going to slip it off the needle. And tighten that up. Now you're going to insert your yarn needle as if to knit into this stitch on the back needle, and you're going to leave it on the needle. You're going to come around to the front again, slip your needle in as if to knit, slide that off the needle, insert your needle as if to purl, leave that alone. Go to the back needle, insert your needle as if to purl, slip it off the needle. Then you're gonna insert your needle as if to knit. And you're gonna leave that stitch right where it is. You're gonna come around to the front and you're gonna knit again. So you're gonna go in as if to knit. That stitch comes off the needle. Then you're gonna go in as if to purl, stitch. That's gonna stay on the needle. Gonna come around to the back, insert as if to purl. That stitch comes off the knitting needle. Insert your needle as if to knit. And that stitch stays put. So basically you just go back and forth from your front needle to your back needle, grafting this toe one stitch at a time. And this is, it's not a difficult skill, but it's definitely something where slow and steady wins the race. You don't want to rush through this and then create like some big unsightly knot in the toe of your sock. I want that looped over my needle. Okay, so now you're down to the last two stitches, and this is really simple. You're just going to treat them exactly like you did all of the other stitches in the row. Okay. So now that we have knit our entire sock, we've knit our toe, and we've kitchenered the tip, it is now time to go back and knit our afterthought heel. So I've already done this on one sock, so I will show you what this looks like. So it looks a lot like our toe, but it's not quite as rounded. It's more of a triangle shape. And so it's just this is your heel right in the middle of your sock where you had where you placed your waist yarn. So I still need to go back and weave in all my ends on this sock, but the sock is done, and this is what your heel will look like when you are finished. So I've got my sock here, and this is where I placed my piece of scrap yarn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my circular needles, and I'm going to pick up stitches along both sides of this piece of waste yarn. So I'm going to pick up all these stitches above it, and I'm going to pick up all these stitches below it. And then I'll show you why we need a DPN in just a minute. So how I'm going to pick up my stitches is I'm just going to take the tip of my needle, and I'm going to go and I'm going to pick up the right leg of each stitch. So you see how there are these little V's? You want to pick up the right leg of each stitch. So what you're going to do is you're going to start at one end of your sock, and you're going to pick up the right leg of that stitch, and then you're just going to skip one leg and pick up the next leg. So you're going to skip over, pick up the next leg. That way you'll keep picking up the right leg of the stitch. And you want to be careful at this point not to split the yarn and not to grab any of your waste yarn either. You just want to be very careful at this point. Okay, so now that I've picked up all the stitches above the green line, I'm going to pull my needle through, turn my sock around, and I'm going to go and do the same thing on this side. Okay, now I've got all my stitches picked up on both sides of my piece of waste yarn, and I'm going to take my double pointed needle and I'm going to insert it under the leg of this first green stitch, and I'm just going to pull it out. So I'm going to go all the way across, sort of picking out this waste yarn. And you want to make sure when you insert your needle under the leg of the stitch that you're not splitting the waste yarn, because that's just going to make it fray and it's going to make it really hard to pick out. Okay, now that we've picked up all of our stitches, we're ready to take our yarn and start knitting our heel. So I am going to start right over here at the edge, and I'm going to take my yarn and I am just going to insert my knitting needle like as if to knit, and I'm going to sort of loop my yarn over that needle, and I'm going to knit my first stitch. And so now I'm going to knit my second stitch, and to anchor my yarn, because I'm starting, I'm joining this ball of yarn again, I'm going to hold both the tail and the working yarn double and knit that stitch, and then I'm going to knit this stitch. So I'm going to knit those two stitches, those second two stitches, and then I'm going to take just my working yarn that's connected to my yarn ball, and I'm going to knit across. Okay, so now that I finished that row, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to pick up this stitch. I'm just going to pick up a stitch from down there, and I'm going to pull the yarn through and put it up on my needle like that. So I'll show you that again over here. So I'm going to get my needle set up, and I'm going to take this right hand needle, and I'm going to go over here on the side, and I'm going to insert my needle into that stitch, that like V, loop my yarn around my needle, and pull it through. Ooh. Okay. So the reason why we're going to pick up stitches in the corners is to avoid any gaps in the sides of the heels. So because we have, so many directions of knitting coming together at once, if you don't pick up those extra stitches, a lot of times you'll end up with a hole there, and no, you don't really, it doesn't really compromise the integrity of the sock. It's not gonna run there or anything like that. It might stretch out a little bit more and the hole might become bigger, but it's not so much a sturdiness of the sock that we want to avoid holes. It just is a little bit unsightly, and your foot's gonna get cold if there's a hole in your sock. So you want to make sure you pick up stitches in those corners. So I always, when I'm picking up stitches for my Afterthought heels, I'm sorry if you can hear my cat running around in the background. She's playing with one of her toys. So when I am picking up stitches in the corners of my socks, I always pick up 2 stitches at each end of the sock. So 2 stitches on each side, and I distribute them, 1 on each needle. So both the needle 1 and needle 2 end up with 2 extra stitches, though they end up with 1 extra stitch at one end and 1 extra stitch at the other end. That just, in my mind, is the neatest way to arrange those extra stitches. So that is what I do. So I'm back to the beginning again. And I want to pick up a stitch on this side. So I'm going to go down here like that stitch. It can be a little bit tricky to hook the yarn sometimes. There we go. And so if you remember correctly, we didn't pick up a stitch when we started this row, so we're going to pick up that stitch now. My tail's getting in the way. I'm just going to stuff that down in the sock and we will take care of that later. So I'm going to loop my yarn around this stitch I've picked up, and then I'm going to continue knitting. So that was my first stitch, and then if you remember, we held the yarn double, so we held the tail and the working yarn together for these first 2 stitches. So I'm just going to knit those 2 little stitches together because they're really just one stitch where we held the yarn double. And then I'm going to knit across. So for this pair of socks, I am knitting socks for someone who has wider feet and wider ankles. So what I want to do is I'm going to knit 4 plain rounds, including that first setup round that I already did, before I start my decreases. So you do not have to knit those 4 plain rounds. If I'm knitting socks for me, I'd usually do 2 plain rounds, including that setup round that I just did before I start my decreases. It is up to you. You know, sock fitting is a little bit of trial and error. It also depends a little bit on not just the size of your feet, but also on how you like your socks. If you like a nice snug fit, then you're going to want to make your heels a little bit different. It's all a learning experience. Alright, so I've done my 4 plain rounds and I am ready to start decreasing my heel. So I'm going to go ahead and arrange my knitting needles. And I'm going to knit, and we're going to work our decrease rounds just like we did for her toes. So I'm going to knit this first stitch, and then I'm going to slip this stitch, knit this stitch, and then pass the slipped stitch over that knitted stitch, just like that. And then I'm going to knit to the last 3 stitches. Okay, and so on this side of the heel, I am going to knit these 2 stitches together by slipping my needle through both stitches as if to knit. And then I'm going to knit this last stitch. So the reason why we do the passing the slip stitched over on this side and the knit 2 together on this side is so that the stitches lean inwards. So the pass the slip stitch over is going to lean towards the left, and the knit 2 together leans towards the right. So we do them on opposite sides. So I'll show you again on the other side of our heel. We're still knitting in the round. So I'm going to knit this first stitch, I'm going to slip the second stitch, knit the third stitch, and then I'm going to pass the slip stitch over the knit stitch, and then I'm going to knit to the last 3 stitches. Now I'm going to knit these 2 stitches together and then knit the last stitch. So now that I've worked 1 decrease round, I'm ready to knit a plain round. And so what you're going to do for your heel is you're just going to alternate knitting a decrease round and then knitting a plain round until you are left with 8 stitches on each needle. So 8 stitches on this needle and then 8 stitches on this needle. Then you're going to take your heel and you're going to Kitchener it, stitched like the toe. If you've liked this tutorial, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss future tutorials. If there is a project or a particular skill you would like me to demonstrate, let me know in the comments down below. So thanks for watching, and I will see you later.